Whether you're looking to buy or rent in Massachusetts, it's no secret that the state is an expensive one to live in, even more so in recent years. And while there are a lot of reasons for that, one comes as a surprise to many. It turns out that a lot of houses aren't being bought by individual people or families at all. Rather, as the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting found out, corporations are buying more and more houses out from under the rest of us. I'm joined by Jenifer McKim, who is the reporter behind that story, along with Rose Webster-Smith, executive director of the nonprofit housing group Springfield No One Leaves. Welcome to both of you. Jenifer, I want to start with you and ask if what's happening here? So I imagine that corporations and companies have always been buying single family homes and, multi-family homes. But what's happening right now?
So it's just happening a lot more. It's true. It's been happening over the last couple decades. There's been increasing investments in residential homes. Businesses are seeing profits around the country, and especially in places like Massachusetts. We have Rose here because particularly when we started looking at this issue in Massachusetts, we found that there's a lot of investors who are seeing particular profits in lower income cities like Springfield, where Rose is from, and other gateway communities. So they're buying up foreclosed homes in the regular market. They're keeping them either to rent or to flip and profit off of them.
I want to show a graph just to underscore what you're talking about, Jenifer. This is a graph that shows the upward projections of the sales of family homes to corporations. The top line is one family, the second line is two family, the third line is three family. And you can see, especially the single family homes, what an increase that is there. Rose, what's the downside to this to a community like Springfield or another urban community? How is it impacting the everyday folks who are living in these communities?
I think it's impacting people living in these communities greatly. We used to be known as the city of homes because it was mainly owner occupied properties within the city of Springfield. And I want to say since 2016, we've become the city of speculator owned homes.
Jenifer, there's some real life impact to this too. If you're out, it's hard enough trying to buy a home right now, almost everywhere. And if you're competing against a company that isn't even going to do an inspection, maybe, or is going to just pay what the asking price is, what's that impact on just everyday buyers who might be qualified with the down payment, ready to buy? How is this
Well,
impacting
there's
them?
there's many different impacts for this, as Rose mentioned, in the communities where you're living in places where your homes are owned by businesses, by home buyers who are trying to go out there and buy properties with prices going up, and investors coming in with all cash sales. And I think it's really, really hard for home buyers to compete when they're competing with people who can compete with all cash. The other issue is related to renting. There is research out there from around the country that LLCs and other business entities are worse landlords than regular individuals, and they're also just much harder to track. You can't find them. The documents make it very easy to sort of they're shell companies really, and you don't know who the owners are. This is a challenge both for cities as well as housing advocates when they're trying to hold somebody accountable.
Rose, this is a problem, as Jenifer writes in the story, that's from Nantucket to Springfield. It's almost every city and town in our state, regardless of its economic status in the hierarchy of income. But when it comes to towns like Revere and Lynn and Springfield, the challenge here is that it also doesn't allow folks to buy within the community that they've grown up in, or if they're renting properties available. We all know that for many folks, the investment in the community in terms of voting and being involved, and renters sometimes don't feel that connection. I imagine that's one of the downsides as well.
Oh, it absolutely is. And as you know, more LLCs buy up properties here in Springfield, we're seeing our voter engagement go down, disenfranchisement with, any type of electoral politics. And it's hard for us out here in Springfield when our mayor election is on an off year versus the other election. So people don't feel engaged, and the LLCs are driving that speculative market up in our rents. When we first started organizing tenants, you could rent a 3-bedroom in Springfield for $900. Now that same 3-bedroom is $1,600.
Jenifer, one of the things that I've understood, on the surface of this, if you're not paying attention, you think, well, what's the big deal? A company comes in, they buy a home that's in foreclosure, or they buy a home that hasn't been kept up for one reason or another. They make improvements and they either flip it or they rent it. But there's a number of challenges with that, especially, you alluded to it just a moment ago. They're not very good landlords statistically, not just here in Massachusetts, but when you look at statistics across the company. In what ways aren't they good landlords?
So I spoke with a Harvard researcher who's been doing some research about this around the country. And basically he found that a lot of these investors are really focusing on Black and brown poorer communities around the country. And they're finding these are really good places to make money from people who've been historically disenfranchised. And that the research that he particularly did in Milwaukee looked at how in these communities, the LLC properties where there were more violations, more problems, more evictions. So generally just a lot, especially when you have out of town, out of state investors. Rose has spoken to me a lot about how a lot of the folks buying in her community are from New York and Boston and California, or even outside of Springfield, and just don't have the same type of interest in being held accountable or need to.
So is there a solution to this? I mean, this is kind of a capitalist society, right? Is there something that towns, city councilors, mayors, governors, is there something that elected officials can do, Rose, to at least put some curbs on this or to protect tenants or communities?
Yes, there's plenty of things that cities and towns and our local legislators can do. So housing trusts, land trusts, rent control, lifting the ban on rent control, tenants' first opportunity to purchase, to turn those buildings into cooperatives so we can expand home ownership in these gateway cities. Stronger eviction protections like sealing your eviction records, otherwise known as Homes Act, and right to counsel. Just to name a few.
Just to name a few. Jenifer, I'm of course going to direct folks to your story at WGBH.org, but it's also a challenge about protections for people. One of the stories that you write about, one of the people that you write about in the story lost her husband and then found herself in a situation where she ended up filing for bankruptcy and being a tenant in this situation. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but can you tell that story? Because I think we need protections for people like that as well.
So Christine Thompson, who is someone that Rose introduced me to, is a grandmother who lived in her home for about 50 years when she lost it to foreclosure to a LLC. And she fought to keep it. It had been sort of a mess related to her finances and her husband who had died. And she ended up being foreclosed upon and then forced out. She tried to fight to save her home. They bought it for $94,000 and recently put it on the market for nearly 3 times that amount of money. So in cases like that, I think there's help that could be. I know that Rose had tried to help her in the legal. There's not enough legal aid for people who are fighting these types of evictions, who are former homeowners in these properties. So I think that's another way to help people. But basically, so often these people are going into court and trying to defend themselves with nobody to help them because there's also no right to counsel.
Yeah, it's amazing when you're sort of in a time when you need it as much as if you're charged in a criminal case, you can't afford. Obviously, if you're in a bankruptcy situation, you may not be able to afford counsel, but there's no right to counsel to represent you in these courts as well. Well, Rose Webster-Smith and Jenifer McKim, I appreciate both of you working on this. Again, I direct folks to WGBH.org to read your great work. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you.